Are you a glass or a lake? The greatest suffering in life does not come from having too many problems, but from having a mind too small to hold them. There was a young man in his early 30s who lived his life in constant frustration. Nothing satisfied him, not his job, not his friends, not even the small, ordinary moments that most people pass without noticing. If something went wrong, he complained. If something didn't go his way, he blamed. Even the smallest inconvenience felt like a heavy burden. A delayed bus, a minor mistake, a simple disagreement. To him, they were not small, they were unbearable. And slowly, his world began to shrink. Not physically, but mentally. Because the more he focused on his problems, the larger they became. And the larger they became, the smaller he felt. Watching all this was his grandfather, a quiet man, a patient observer of life. At first, he thought time would change his grandson. That experience would teach him, that life itself would soften his reactions. But time passed, and nothing changed. If anything, the young man had become worse, not because his problems had grown, but because his tolerance had shrunk. One evening, after another long day of complaints, the grandfather made a decision, not to argue, not to lecture, but to show. The lesson begins. "Go to the market," he said calmly, "and bring me 2 kilos of salt." The young man frowned, confused, but he went. When he returned, the grandfather took 1 kilo of salt and dissolved it into a glass of water. "Drink this." The young man hesitated, but took a sip. Instantly, his face twisted. "What is this?" he snapped. "It's terrible, bitter." His frustration returned immediately. The grandfather asked quietly, "What made the water taste like that?" "Salt," the young man replied, confident, certain. The grandfather nodded. "Come with me." The walk to the lake. They walked in silence, through narrow paths, past familiar places, until they reached a lake. Wide, still, endless compared to the glass. The grandfather took another kilo of salt and threw it into the lake. "Now, drink." The young man bent down, cupped his hands, and took a sip. He paused, then drank again. The grandfather asked, "How does it taste?" The young man looked surprised. "Fresh, calm, normal. Did you taste the salt?" "No." The grandfather looked at him with quiet wisdom. "The salt is the same. 1 kilo in the glass, 1 kilo in the lake. But the experience is completely different." He paused. "The problem is not the salt. It is the size of the container." Silence. "You see, my son, life will always give you salt. Problems, pain, disappointments, that part you cannot control. But what you can control is how much space you give them." At that moment, something shifted. The young man began to see not his problems but himself, his reactions, his mindset, his narrow way of seeing the world. He realized he had been living like a glass, small, limited, overflowing at the slightest pressure. When life added salt, he became bitter. But the lake absorbed it, without losing its nature, without changing its essence, because it was larger, deeper, wider. Life is 10% what happens to us and 90% how we react to it. John C. Maxwell. Your problem is not the problem. Your reaction is the problem. Eckhart Tolle. The greater part of our happiness or misery depends upon our dispositions. Martha Washington. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can control your attitude toward what happens. Brian Tracy. So ask yourself, when life adds salt, what do you become? A glass that turns bitter, or a lake that remains calm? Because the goal of life is not to avoid problems. It is to become large enough to hold them without losing yourself. Don't ask for less problems. Become more than them.